Welcome back to Business Talk here on businesstech.co.za, South Africa's leading business news platform. As always, your host, Michael Avery here. And today we're talking the crucial world of trade, a lifeline for economies across the globe and particularly vital for Africa's growth. Interestingly, at a time where it does feel like we see tariff barriers being erected and we almost see a push back against trade and globalization, largely driven initially out of the Trump presidency. And here we are just a couple of days away from another potential Trump presidency. So in an era where international trade corridors are evolving rapidly, there's lots of uncertainty. What does all of this mean when it comes to financing trade and seizing on those challenges and opportunities, more importantly? Well, joining me today are two experts from Standard Bank's Corporate and Investment Banking Division who are really at the forefront of shaping Africa's trade landscape. We've got Justin Milo, Head of Trade for South Africa, and Amish Shunker, who's Head of Trade for Africa Regions and Solutions Structuring. And together we're going to shed some light on the current performance of trade across the continent and what the future holds as Africa continues to try and unlock its potential. Chaps, great to have you on the show. Firstly, Amish, if you could just kick things off, if you could reflect on the performance of international trade in Africa so far in 2024, how has it been evolving and what are the standout trends that you've observed?
Sure, thanks, Michael. So I think in terms of trade on the continent, we've seen imports roughly grow at around about 3%, maybe just over 3% over the course of the last year. And then probably on the export front, we've seen exports grow at about 4% year on year. I think a few factors sort of stand out. There may be macro in their orientation, there may be political in their orientation. The high levels of sovereign debt have had a huge impact in terms of how clients are doing business. Soaring commodity prices, the same depreciation, devaluation of our exchange rates and currencies rather have had a huge impact in terms of how clients do business. And by virtue of that, I think, especially as it relates to imports, there has been a slight curb or a slight tapering off, especially based on the cost imposition that this has created on some of the clients, some of the local clients that operate in Africa. And as such, what we've been observing is that there's a change from imported products that are from outside of the continent to actually more a substitution profile of products. So either they can be obtained and procured locally, or they can be obtained and procured from a regional bloc that is pretty close by. I think as it relates to exportation, from an export point of view, some of that devaluation that I spoke about has resulted in margin erosion. We have seen clients thus have a lot more focus on optimization of their value chains and cost and profitability optimization. So I think that's really some of the key messages that I've taken out of this year so far.
And then narrowing it down a bit, Justin, how has South Africa's international trade fared in particular this year?
Thanks, Michael. So in terms of South Africa's international trade, in the first 9 months of the year so far, it's been relatively muted. Our exports are down by about 1.8% year on year, while our imports are down by about 5% over the same period. Now, if you look at those particular statistics, there are broad macroeconomic statistics, but there are a few growth areas that I'd like to point out. The first growth area to look at is our regional trade. Now, if you look at our trade with our traditional trading partners, South Africa's trade has actually declined with our traditional trading partners. However, our international trade with the rest of the African continent has actually grown. So South Africa's exports into the rest of Africa have grown by about 6% year on year, while our imports from the rest of the African continent have increased by about 16% year on year. Then if you look at some of the key commodity drivers, on the export side, we are seeing good growth on the exports of agricultural products as well as manufactured food and beverage products, and to a lesser extent, mineral products. So these are not necessarily your usual suspects when it comes to export commodities. And then on the import front, we are seeing an increase in the imports of chemical products, while our traditional import drivers such as pharmaceuticals and fuel have declined year on year. And then finally, if you look at our trade balance, we have a trade surplus of 100 billion rand, and this actually shows that our exports are larger than our imports. And this will definitely provide good support to our export-orientated industries within South Africa. On a year-on-year basis, our trade surplus has actually increased by 40 billion rand. So while our international trade might be down year-on-year, there are actually good signs of growth, whether you look at our trade balance, or whether you look at key commodities, which we're starting to see growth in, or even if you just look at our regional trade.
So much to unpack in that, and really positive. I just think from a macro trade balance perspective, really good for the currency at a company level to see that we're diversifying our export markets and we're no longer reliant on our traditional trading partners. That just builds in resilience. When it comes to some of the key themes and drivers of trade finance in the market at the moment, Amish, what do you see as the big drivers? Are we looking for more export credit guarantee type situations? Are there any new developments that businesses should be paying attention to?
Yeah, I think, Michael, as it relates to the services that commercial banks like ourselves provide to our clients, it's in response to a particular demand or a need. And maybe that could be categorized into three things. The first is risk mitigation, so to help them de-risk some of the transactions that they do, some of the facilitation of flow that they do. The second is to help them grow, typically through the advent of type of liquidity stimulus. And probably the third thing is to make them more efficient. And our alliance to do that is largely technology driven here. So I think as it relates to what I've seen on the African side or outside of South Africa, and perhaps the themes are somewhat consistent, is that move that I spoke about towards local procurement. It's also created a need for more local currency borrowing. And that takes nothing away from the fact that as an African continent, we are a net importer cross-border, and cross-border, again, I'm referring to outside of the continent. So foreign currency is something that a lot of clients need. But in this particular instance, I guess over the course of the last maybe 18 months or so, that move towards local procurement has informed more local borrowing. As these macros have unfolded, there's also a further demand for that liquidity to try and sustain the value chain linked to clients. So where they're looking at input, where they're looking at raw materials to continue with their production, to continue with their cycles, it is in an effort to ensure that entire supply chain remains sustainable, remains resilient, and there's supply chain continuity. There has been a greater demand for local currency borrowing. Linked to the cost point, I guess, as well, is the move away from maybe some of the more traditional, conventional forms of borrowing from clients. What we're seeing now is a more inclusive type of solution set that's required from clients. And why? It's because they want to pass on some of the, let's call it the financial benefit into that same value chain. A solution that comes to mind is supply financing or payables financing. Historically, one of those solutions that largely the multinational corporations, sophisticated, based out of Europe and Asia and America have required and made leverage of. Now you're finding some of our large local African corporates, our Pan-African corporates, that have this requirement for solutions. So I think that's largely been a driver of trade finance. It would be remiss of me if I don't mention the risk perception associated with the African continent. So where I find clients that are trading with, maybe not necessarily based on, but trading with the continent, there's always been that need for, again, banks like ourselves to offer them with some type of payment security or risk mitigation again. It's been no different this year, especially associated with a lot of the importation that we've done from the continent or into the continent.
Right. Interesting to note that local procurement and local borrowing trend. Justin, what are you seeing from a South African market perspective? Interestingly, I was recently chatting to CFAO South Africa, and they really are using South Africa as a springboard through AMS into regions in SADC and East Africa. They're expanding now into Francophone Africa. So there does seem to be a lot more of kind of using South Africa as this beachhead or springboard or gateway into Africa again that we heard about maybe 10 years ago. It was a big theme. But from a trade finance perspective, what are you noticing?
So from a trade finance perspective, we are seeing an increase in the demand for solutions to assist our clients in the mitigation of payment risk. And this is in particular in respect of our clients exporting into the rest of Africa. Now, this is against the backdrop of foreign currency liquidity challenges, as well as sovereign downgrades across these markets in Africa. And for some of our clients, exporting into the rest of Africa is uncharted territory. So it naturally comes with an element of apprehension, as well as an increase in the perceived counterparty payment risk in dealing in these particular markets. As a result of this, we've seen an increase in the demand for solutions such as letters of credit, as well as guarantees and LC confirmations. We have also seen an increase in the demand for short-term financing, as well as working capital funding. And this has been across the broad spectrum of working capital solutions that we offer, from simple overdrafts all the way through to our supply chain finance product suite. Now, in terms of client needs, we are seeing that our client needs around these short-term financing solutions is around the need for liquidity and cash flow enhancement, as well as a need for balance sheet enhancement, and then as well as around the need for the promotion of supply chain continuity and more broadly sustainability within supply chains. From a trade finance perspective, we also do issue performance guarantees and financial guarantees to support infrastructure projects. And within the South African context, we have seen an increase in the demand for these instruments. And this has been across a broad spectrum of infrastructure types, from renewable energy all the way through to roads, ports, and civil construction. So we may actually be starting to see a bit of a turning point in that particular sector.
That'd be a welcome bit of news. Recently traveling to Mombasa and Nairobi, there is a desperate need for public-private partnerships to increase road build, just to open up bottlenecks to economic growth. Intra-African trade, though, and Amish, to bring you in on this point, we've been talking about it for a long time. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement was all about bringing down the tariff barriers. We still see some of those non-tariff barriers, moving goods cross-border. Border posts can be delayed. Do we have similar labeling, regulatory, the kind of regimes that don't match or dovetail? What is your assessment of intra-African trade in 2024? Are we getting there? Are we making progress?
Sure, Michael. I think, intra-African trade right now stems or ranges somewhere in between 13 to 16% of global or of all trade done on the continent. And with the Africa Continental Free Trade Area being the largest trade bloc in the world, you'd kind of expect that there'd be a lot more momentum at that cross-border flow of goods between Africans, or amongst Africans per se. At this point in time, I think it's worthwhile noting that the challenges associated with a lot of what we've seen, yes, there may be some degree of tariff barriers that have been placed, but it's also not necessarily that those tariff barriers that have allowed us to reach that type of prospect, to reach that type of momentum. Yeah. And I guess, again, it would be remiss of me not to speak about these challenges. I think the first and foremost challenge is probably road and rail infrastructure. If I have to look at the sheer landmass of what the African continent is, the type of terrain that we face, maybe relative to some of our European counterparts, some of the Asian markets or trade blocs, and then, of course, the Americas, it's vastly different. So the challenge that it imposes is significant for ourselves. And this is where potentially some of that private-public sector partnership that you kind of touched on could really make a difference. I think another one of the challenges that we've seen is manufacturing and production capacity. The demand from Africans, if I have to look at what's imported from markets like China and markets like India right now, it's really the finished consumer goods. So if there was that degree of manufacturing and production capacity, that would effectively create a different type of demand by Africans across in other markets, in other regions, et cetera, et cetera. Linked to manufacturing capacity, I think, is power supply or electricity supply. And I think it doesn't matter whether you look at a market like South Africa, whether you look at a market like Nigeria or somewhere in the middle, Malawi, at some point or the other, there is that experience of electricity deficiency. And I think electricity deficiency is going to have that impact again on manufacturing capacity. And by virtue of that, again, it alludes to the whole advent of that engagement between the private sector and the public sector. something that's worthwhile mentioning, in my view, is the success associated with some of the more proficient trade blocks, I'll call it that for now, has been the type of integration that we've seen. And let's use Asia as an example. The type of integration that you've seen between countries associated with documentation, with regulation, with taxes, and then also financial incentives. It's not necessarily the type of intervention and integration that we've seen on the African continent. That being said, I think it was in 2022, what the Secretariat of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area pronounced on was something called, the acronym is GTI, it's the Guided Trade Initiative. So what that Guided Trade Initiative actually does is it formulates a protocol and basically guides countries to be able to do transactions with each other in a particular way. At the outset, there were 7 countries that were given this type of initiative to fall back on and to rely on and to work with across a very select set of products. What we then found was that these countries were able to trade with each other a lot more efficiently in a very calibrated way, and thereby, and subsequent to that, what has been done is in 2024, that remit of countries and goods has actually increased. So it is a case of it hasn't necessarily reached its potential, but there are at least momentum and activity. There's at least momentum and activity in place to actually do that. I think the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement Summit took place in Kigali, was last week or the week before. And some of our colleagues had the good fortune of going off and visiting and attending the conference. And one of the most important pieces of feedback that we received was that there is more a practical discussion that's taking place between counterparties across countries, and then also with the public sector itself. To paraphrase, I think maybe as I sum up, to paraphrase one of my colleagues' post that the attendance to the conference. I think the African Continental Free Trade Agreement or area is in effect a battle. It's a battle for Africans to fight, and it's a battle for Africans to actually win. That would be my summation around trade in the continent.
Yeah, and maybe, I mean, if you build on that, Justin, if you look at South Africa's largest intra-African trading partners, who are they, and what makes these relationships so unique or particularly significant for our economy in South Africa?
So the African continent is extremely important to the South African economy. You'll routinely see that there are African countries within South Africa's top 10 trading partners, both on the export side as well as on the import side. If we look at our export flows, our key trading partners on the African continent include Mozambique, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Namibia, and Botswana. And some of the key commodity drivers include vehicles, products of iron and steel, machinery and equipment, as well as manufactured products such as food and beverages. Now, the importance of these particular export flows is that they are a source of demand for South Africa's industrial sector. And as a result of that, these export flows assist in promoting growth and employment in these particular industries. Then if we move to the import side, our imports from the rest of the African continent are dominated by fuel imports and in particular crude oil imports from Nigeria. And I think there's a lot more that can be done in terms of South African companies actually importing from the rest of the African continent, given that our import flows are relatively low from the rest of the African continent. And the importance of these import flows is that it actually enables a customer to diversify their supply chains, and it also helps companies to find alternate sources of supply. And as we saw during COVID, it's not necessarily a good thing to place too much reliance on a particular supplier in a particular jurisdiction for an extended period of time. If you look at the quantum of our import flows and our export flows, you'll see that South Africa's got a trade surplus with the rest of the African continent, and that trade surplus is around 275 billion rand. So it really shows you that these flows are dominated by South Africa's exports into the rest of the African continent, and I think more can be done in terms of South African companies importing from the rest of the African continent. What I think can actually help promote that is the upgrade of infrastructure to promote, greater efficiency and convenience as it relates to intra-African trade. And I think for a number of African countries, there should be a focus on the implementation of industrial policies to actually promote the growth of key export industries.
Yeah, you want to be sending those 40-foot containers into Africa full, offload them, and then fill them up and bring them back in again. So it's two-way trade flows. But to your point, this is a process. We're at different levels of maturity in terms of our manufacturing bases, but it's very encouraging to hear that this kind of trade flow is at least providing a spur for local manufacturing to give us those economies of scale. And we need those markets that are bigger than just our local market. Looking at beyond intra-Africa trade, who are South Africa's largest international trading partners, and what do you see driving these trade flows at the moment?
So beyond the African continent, we have established trading relationships with countries all across the world and various international trading blocs. Our largest trading partner region is the Asian continent, where some of the key drivers of the trade flows between South Africa and Asia include China and India, as well as Japan on the export side and the UAE on the import side. Beyond the Asian continent, we also have established relationships with European countries such as the UK, Italy, France, Germany, and Netherlands. And then, of course, we do have established trading relationships with the US as well. Some of the key commodity drivers on the export side include mineral products and precious metals, motor vehicles, as well as agricultural products and manufactured food and beverage products. On the import front, some of the key commodity drivers are, crude oil as well as fuel, pharmaceuticals, vehicles, and machinery and equipment.
Amish, what trends and themes are you seeing with respect to key international trade corridors evolving in Africa? Are there any emerging markets or regions that are becoming increasingly important?
Yeah, I think Justin's touched on all of them already. But I think specifically for the rest of the African continent, the Africa-China corridor remains hugely important. If I look at the quantum of goods exported, and this is largely natural resources, raw materials that go off into China, just the demand that surely stems from them is huge, and that's why it's one of our largest partners. If I have to look at imports, again, it's associated with the finished goods, with the consumer goods. If I have to look at our population from an African continental point of view, we've got a young population. We also have, from a sub-Saharan perspective, our GDP ranks at roughly, or forecast to be roughly around 4.2, 4.5%. Rest of the world is around about 3.1%. So we are kind of a natural fit for supply from many of these markets. And China certainly does tick the box. The other part of an investment, which is also, in my view, a type of trade flow, is what we've seen from Chinese state-owned corporations or state-owned entities, and then Chinese corporates themselves, especially as it relates to some of the project infrastructure work that's being done on the continent. If I have to take a view on what's being done in Eastern Africa, what's being done in Southern Africa, there's a lot of response from these entities from China in terms of allowing us to be able to fulfill those projects and get those needs dealt or fulfilled again. I think the other corridor that I think is very important, again, Justin's touched on it, and that would be the Africa-Middle East corridor. Just sheerly the requirement for, as Africa, we remain a net importer of fuel and refined petroleum product. In the Middle East, all of those various jurisdictions have a strategic advantage in terms of the ability to explore, produce, and then refine at a very good price point. And then logistically, the connectivity along our East Coast and down into Southern Africa just makes it really efficient for us to, again, service the demand. And the demand for this particular commodity and product ultimately is the lifeblood of our economies. I think, lastly, maybe an emerging corridor is probably India. Over the course of the last 5 to 9 years, we've seen India now step in as one of the top 10 trading partners, top 10 trading countries that Africa has continentally. Largely the supply of healthcare and, again, finished products at that prevailing good cost-effective price point is what stimulates that type of demand of their finished product. And then again, from an export perspective, alluding to the natural resources and the raw materials, that would be what we find as exports going into India. So I think India, emergingly, it's going to be a focus for a lot of clients and a lot of corporates on the continent, and certainly for banks as well.
Yeah, and with the expanding BRICS Plus, that becomes even more important for us in South Africa to look at the opportunities in these strategic relationships. Amish, I'm going to let you wrap us up. What are your key predictions for trade in 2025? Are there shifts or trends that we should be looking at? AI, machine learning, all of these buzzwords. What are the big ones that you're looking forward to next year?
Yeah, I think if I had to look into my crystal ball, what I'd predict is probably unpredictability in many ways. But at the same time, I think there's some level of consistent flow that we'll continue to see over the course of next year and probably even beyond. With the whole cycle of elections that have gone on, not just in Africa, but globally, I think there have been a few infrastructure development programs and projects that have been put on hold, both on the private side as well as then on the public side. I think now that this cycle of elections has or is coming to a close, we'll probably see a lot more stimulus around that, a lot more progression around that. What that does, though, is the value chains associated with those infrastructure projects also then gain a new type of lifeblood. So I think there's definitely going to be a continuation of those projects, and that's going to be beyond 2025. Yeah. I think the focus on cost, the focus on inflation, the focus on supply chain diversity, and yet at the same time managing sustainability, that's definitely going to continue. Certainly, if this dynamic environment that we live in Africa continues, and we do see certain additional price escalations on the commodity side, we do see sovereigns and central banks try to manage inflation accordingly. Yeah, there's going to be that focus on cost. And by virtue of that, I think there'll be that increased view from clients into the financial services sector to respond accordingly. So that remark that I made around the more inclusive type of trade financing solutions to try and assist that value chain and alleviate some of that pressure, that cost pressure, I think that's definitely going to be something that we see. And then from an experience point of view with regards to clients, I think most importantly that I've seen within or on the trade front, Michael, is that timing is everything, speed is everything, and efficiency is everything. And where I'll go with this is probably a banking example. For clients to be able to access foreign currency liquidity on the African continent, it's usually by the advent of a letter of credit. That's just common practice, east, west, north, south. It's typically how it's been. The investment that banks have made in OCR capability, optical character recognition capability, machine learning, and all of these wonderful AI algorithm-based advents, that's actually ensured that we as banks can facilitate transactions faster, specifically those types of letter of credit transactions, faster for our clients, so that they can clear goods quickly, so that they can deliver to off-takers more efficiently. So the point, I guess, that I'm making around all of this is, if there is value to some of the technology advents, and I use the banking example, but this could be associated with warehousing, it could be associated with logistics, it could be associated with anything really. But I think if clients see value, there will definitely be an investment in it. And I think there will definitely be a benefit of it, not only for 2025, but certainly beyond that as well.
Well, fascinating. That brings us to the end of another insightful episode of Business Talk, where we've explored the vital role that trade plays in shaping Africa's economic landscape and some of those solutions that the banking sector is bringing to bear to ensure that we can leverage the big opportunity that we have as a continent to increase intra-African trade. A big thank you to Amish, Shunker, and to Milo from Standard Bank CIB for sharing those insights and perspectives on the current trends and the future opportunities in trade finance. As always, we're going to continue to keep an eye on these developments as they unfold, especially with 2025 shaping up to be such a pivotal year for trade in Africa. As always, thank you to our viewers for tuning in. We look forward to seeing you next time here on Business Talk. Until then, I'm Michael Avery.